Welcome to Jackson Hole Classical Academy's first academic lecture. This is a re-recording of the lecture, so if you're watching online, thank you so much for joining me. For those who don't know, my name is Evan McGraw, and I teach great books, history of Christianity, art history, and studio art. Before I begin, I want to give a quick explanation of what we're doing here. The point of this lecture series is simply to appreciate and analyze great art, literature, music, and other forms of media from a classical perspective. A classical view of art holds that all great works seek to explore fundamental questions about reality, about our place in the universe, how we relate to God, to each other, and to ourselves. All great works exist in a conversation spanning human history, and each work draws forth different aspects of goodness, beauty, and truth. If we're thinking about art as a conversation, it's fitting that this first semester of lectures will focus on Arthurian legend. These stories have been told and retold for over 1,000 years, and each age brings a new perspective to the material. Thus, reading these legends across time and across different media can help us gain a deeper understanding of the stories and of the perennial themes they explore. One of the recurring themes of Arthurian legend across time is the tension between the ideal society and the acknowledgement of human frailty. We'll see that tension today with an emphasis on frailty, specifically in the experience of both love and death. The story we're discussing is that of the Lady of Shalott, a lady who's cursed to live in a tower and weave a tapestry based on what she sees in a mirror that reflects the outside world. If she turns away from the mirror or leaves her tower, she will die. At the end of the story, she does leave the tower and she does die. And I'm going to argue that this choice reflects a certain existential dilemma that we all face as human beings. However, I'm also going to break academic conventions here because I'm not stating a specific thesis about what this story means, at least not yet. My reasoning is that I want to illustrate what it looks like to simply pay very close attention to a work of art and to let the meaning slowly arise from that attentiveness. We'll get to a thesis, an overall sense of meaning, but that's going to come near the end of the talk. So please hang in there with me and let's simply attend to these works of art. Perhaps the most well-known version of this story is Alfred Lord Tennyson's 1842 poem, The Lady of Shalott. This is a later version of a poem written a decade prior. We're looking at the later version because I find it more aesthetically complete, whereas the former is definitely rougher around the edges. So the poem is divided into 4 parts. I'm going to read each one, and as I do, I will walk us through the ways Tennyson is exploring themes of love, death, and human finitude. So here is part 1. On either side the river lie long fields of barley and of rye that clothe the wold and meet the sky, and through the field the road runs by to many-towered Camelot. And up and down the people go, gazing where the lilies blow, round an island there below, the island of Shalott. Willows whiten, aspens quiver, little breezes dusk and shiver, through the wave that runs forever, by the island in the river flowing down to Camelot. 4 gray walls and 4 gray towers overlook a space of flowers, and the silent isle embowers the Lady of Shalott. By the margin, willow-veiled, slide the heavy barges trailed, by slow horses and unhailed, the shallop flitteth silken-sailed, skimming down to Camelot. But who hath seen her wave her hand, or at the casement seen her stand, or is she known in all the land, the Lady of Shalott? Only reapers reaping early, in among the bearded barley, hear a song that echoes cheerily from the river winding clearly down to towered Camelot. And by the moon the reaper weary, piling sheaves in uplands airy, listening whispers, 'tis the fairy Lady of Shalott. Okay, so Tennyson sets the scene first by describing the island of Shalott as it can be seen from outside observers. It sits in the river outside Camelot, surrounded by aspens and willows. It lies close enough to the road that all the commerce to and from the city must pass by it. To the passers-by, the island is a strange curiosity. They stand to watch the lilies and wonder at the hearsay of the lady living there. To them, she's basically a legend. But who hath seen her wave her hand, or at the casement seen her stand? Imagine people looking up to the castle windows and seeing only darkness. To them, the lady either does not exist or she inhabits this anomalous reality that shouldn't be trifled with. The lady does interact with the world through the eerie song she sings, heard by the reapers reaping early. This being her only interaction with society, ironically has the effect of further alienating her from it. The reapers hear the song and utter furtive whispers about the fairy lady in the tower. Now, with the word fairy here, we're meant to think of the fae, of untamed, malevolent, supernatural beings. It's not a positive connotation. By showing the lady from the perspective of the people of Camelot, Tennyson makes a masterful choice as he sets the scene, because he establishes her as a stranger to society. She's an outsider. This framing is important because, as we'll see, her status as an outsider torments her. We begin to see this fact in part 2 when Tennyson zooms in on the castle itself and we finally see the lady from her own perspective. So here is part 2. There she weaves by night and day, a magic web with colors gay. She has heard a whisper say, a curse is on her if she stay to look down to Camelot. She knows not what the curse may be, and so she weaveth steadily, and little other care hath she, the Lady of Shalott. And moving through a mirror clear that hangs before her all the year, shadows of the world appear. There she sees the highway near, winding down to Camelot. There the river eddy whirls, and there the surly village churls and the red cloaks of market girls pass onward from Shalott. Sometimes a troop of damsels glad, an abbot on an ambling pad, sometimes a curly shepherd lad or a long-haired page in crimson clad goes by to towered Camelot. And sometimes through the mirror blue the knights come riding two and two, she hath no loyal knight and true, the Lady of Shalott. But in her web she still delights to weave the mirror's magic sights, and often through the silent nights a funeral with plumes and lights and music went to Camelot. Or when the moon was overhead, came two young lovers lately wed. I am half sick of shadows, said the Lady of Shalott. So now we see the lady from her own perspective. We see how she weaves alone, night and day. She knows of the curse, but only as through a whisper. Thus, she works not out of fear, but out of a vague sense of resolution. It's her vocation to weave this tapestry. But in her web, she still delights to weave the mirror's magic sights. But she obviously doesn't purely delight in her work. Contrast the gray description of her tower with the richer description of the world outside. The use of color, for example, red cloaks of village girls or the knights riding through the mirror blue. The specificity of the people she sees, from abbots to village churls, also points to her attentiveness to the life outside the tower. At the mention of knights, the poem notes, she hath no loyal knight and true. This line highlights her own desire for chivalric love. The poem doesn't speak of this desire directly, but if we think of this description as coming from the lady's own perspective, it makes sense psychologically. To see something and to immediately say, well, I don't have that and I never will, clearly belies both a desire for it and a resignation about its unattainability. The lady sees the knights, wishes she had a lover, but resigns herself to the fact that she will never be part of the world outside the tower. But the final stanza is fascinating because in it her resignation shatters. In the quiet night drift the lights and music of a funeral, and lovers walk by moonlight at the river. The lady witnesses askance the most poignant moments of human experience, of death and of love. The contrast between the two highlighting life's capacity for the greatest sorrow and the greatest joy. This extremity, this capacity for passion, instills in the lady a desperate desire to participate in the cosmos she finds herself locked out of. She admits, I am half sick of shadows. She doesn't just want to view life indirectly through a mirror. She wants to plunge into it, to feel the same sorrow and joy as everybody else. Here, Tennyson sets up the fundamental dichotomy of the poem. Two possible ways of being in the world. One option is this. You can sequester yourself away, hide from human experience, retain your independence from the sorrows of life, but give up the possibility of love in the process. Or you can dive into life and open yourself up both to love and to suffering. Here I'm paraphrasing a C.S. Lewis quote on how there's no such thing as impervious love. In our fundamentally imperfect human experience, we can't love without the possibility of sorrow. So the lady has a choice. Remain in the stagnant, timeless, changeless perfection of her tower, or give up these shadows for the more imperfect but more real cosmos of experience, where love is possible. James J. Hill, while expounding his own interpretation, re-articulates this common reading as follows. We are told that the lady is isolated from reality, but that she is drawn out of her isolation by love for someone or something outside herself. But she must choose whether or not to retain that isolation or to abandon it for love. So let's see how she makes this choice in part 3. A bow shot from her bower eaves, he rode between the barley sheaves. The sun came dazzling through the leaves and flamed upon the brazen greaves of bold Sir Lancelot. A red-crossed knight forever kneeled to a lady in his shield that sparkled on the yellow field beside remote Shalott. The gemmy bridle glittered free, like to some branch of stars we see hung in the golden galaxy. The bridle bells rang merrily as he rode down to Camelot. And from his blazoned baldric slung a mighty silver bugle hung, and as he rode his armor rung beside remote Shalott. All in the blue unclouded weather, thick jeweled shone the saddle leather, the helmet and the helmet feather burned like one burning flame together as he rode down to Camelot. And as often through the purple night, below the starry clusters bright, some bearded meteor trailing light moves over still Shalott. His broad, clear brow in sunlight glowed. On burnished hooves his warhorse trode. From underneath his helmet flowed his coal-black curls as on he rode down to Camelot. From the bank and from the river he flashed into the crystal mirror. Tira lira by the river sang Sir Lancelot. She left the web, she left the loom, she made 3 paces through the room. She saw the water lily bloom, she saw the helmet and the plume. She looked down to Camelot. Out flew the web and floated wide, the mirror cracked from side to side. The curse has come upon me, cried the Lady of Shalott. When Lancelot appears, the perspective zooms in even more intensely. On his shield, a knight kneels before his lady, an emblem of the chivalric love Lancelot represents. He's described with the language of fire and starlight. We see his armor dazzling in the sun. His bridle glitters like stars hung in a golden galaxy. The helmet and the helmet feather burned like one burning flame together, and he moves like a meteor flashing in the night sky. He's both intensely particular and cosmic, as if the lady's focus narrows in on him only to expand outward to encompass the entire universe. Thus, Lancelot represents not only chivalric love, but also the life-filled cosmos the lady desires to inhabit. When she turns from her weaving, the stanza's use of repetition fits the tension of the moment, as Hill points out in his analysis. She left the web, she left the loom, she made 3 paces through the room, she saw the water lily bloom. The repetition of simple active verbs also accentuates the active nature of the choice she's making. She will no longer stand back and watch the world from a distance. Instead, she finally chooses to take part in it. At this moment of heightened drama, however, the mirror cracks and the lady suddenly knows that she is going to die. Part 4 of the poem then recounts her final moments, her final attitude toward this universe she's chosen to enter. So here is part 4. In the stormy east wind straining, the pale yellow woods were waning, the broad stream in its banks complaining, heavily the low sky raining overtowered Camelot. Down she came and found a boat, beneath a willow left afloat, and round about the prow she wrote, the Lady of Shalott. And down the river's dim expanse, like some bold seer in a trance, seeing all his own mischance, with a glassy countenance did she look to Camelot. And at the closing of the day, she loosed the chain and down she lay. The broad stream bore her far away, the Lady of Shalott. Lying robed in snowy white, that loosely flew to left and right, the leaves upon her falling light, through the noises of the night, she floated down to Camelot. And as the boat heel wound along the willowy hills and fields among, they heard her singing her last song, the Lady of Shalott. Heard a carol, mournful, holy, chanted loudly, chanted lowly, till her blood was frozen slowly, and her eyes were darkened wholly, turned to towered Camelot. For ere she reached upon the tide, the first house by the waterside, singing in her song she died, the Lady of Shalott. Under tower and balcony, by garden wall and gallery, a gleaming shape she floated by, dead pale, between the houses high, silent into Camelot. Out upon the wharfs they came, knight and burgher, lord and dame, and round the prow they read her name, the Lady of Shalott. Who is this, and what is here? And in the lighted palace near died the sound of royal cheer, and they crossed themselves for fear, all the knights of Camelot. But Lancelot mused a little space. He said, "She has a lovely face. God in his mercy grant her grace, the Lady of Shalott." So part 4 begins with an abrupt change in weather. The wind blows, the river swells, autumn yellows the trees. In his close reading of the poem, Edgar F. Shannon Jr. suggests that the shift from spring to autumn coincides with the lady's existential state. The season flames in its last burst of life before the long, cold death of winter, mirroring the lady's final plunge into reality before she too succumbs to death. She hops into a boat, and as she floats down the river, Tennyson describes the intensity of her experience. She lies down and listens to the sounds of night. Leaves fall gently down on her, and she sings one last song, a carol, mournful, holy, chanted loudly, chanted lowly. The repetition here and disjointed adjectives helps to convey the trance-like nature of this act. She experiences life and death simultaneously. Shannon observes that instead of the wispy fairy song she sang at the beginning of the poem, her song now takes on a certain supernatural grandeur, both sad and sacred. What makes the song holy is its real engagement with the sacredness of life, the beauty and grace of human experience, not lessened but heightened by the fact that such experience is limited. The lady's last song acknowledges the brevity of our time on earth, but it also calls attention to the infinite meaning of each moment, each falling leaf, each willow on the hill. Like many during this time in British literary history, Tennyson is concerned with the idea of enchantment, the idea that creation conveys glimpses into the supernatural. To know the overabundant beauty of all that exists is to see life as sacred, created by God and therefore open to transcendent meaning. This attitude sees the potential for God's grace to intrude into all aspects of created reality, even in death. For the lady, and allegorically for us as well, it may take the reality of loss to see that sacredness. When someone asked the theologian Peter Kraft how to see everything as sacred, he answered, "Get diagnosed with cancer." Now, this answer may be a little glib, but I do think he has a point. When we are aware of our own death, we become much more intentional about appreciating the abundant beauty all around us. We too gain the ability to see creation, beautiful but finite, in the context of an eternal song of praise. Given the pain and suffering that life entails, the song may indeed be mournful, but it is also holy because it reveals the preciousness of life and points to the divine. So this reality of death enables us to more fully view the world with love. But the poem also applies to a more intrinsic relationship between love and death. That is, that real love may entail pain and loss and suffering, which is a sort of internal death. Think of how those we love most are also the people we may hurt most poignantly and who may hurt us. Because in loving them, we open our souls to them and make ourselves vulnerable. And even aside from interpersonal conflict, loving may hurt because it may entail hurting with those who suffer, bearing their burdens as our own. Indeed, love may hold a sort of terror. When you love in any context, you let go of your self-sufficiency. You turn to this other person or group of people or this other aspect of creation and say, in Joseph Pieper's terms, "It's good that you exist. I'm glad that you are here." And when you do that, you let your well-being be caught up in the well-being of the other. You say, "Your good is my good, and your suffering is my suffering." That takes an incredible amount of vulnerability. To give up self-sufficiency in this way means giving up our standard approach to survival. It's no longer about me and my happiness. For people who are closed off from love in their own quotidian concerns, that sort of openness can be disarming, a terrifying portent of death's possibility. Perhaps it's fitting then that the citizens of Camelot react with fear when they find the lady's corpse. They see the lady clothed in spectral white, lying still in the boat, and they cross themselves. The lady hits them with a numinous reality, a reality of something beyond their normal experience. Her death startles the rest of Camelot into an awareness that their daily commerce is not the end-all, be-all of life. Shannon argues that the lady's final song is holy precisely because it calls the people of Camelot out of their own selfishness, just as the lady was called out of her own egocentric stagnation in the tower. Shannon argues that she must leave the tower to become fully human. No longer a mindless automaton, she becomes fully human by accepting her curse, which Shannon equates to the curse of all humanity, the curse that goes along with original sin, that is mortality. And yet, it's far better to be human and cursed to die than to not accept our human condition at all. The poem therefore reveals the tragic nobility of human nature. We are embarrassingly finite, and yet we yearn for the infinite. For Tennyson and for many other poets and theologians, it's only when you accept your finitude that you are truly open to that infinite. Okay, so that's Tennyson's presentation of the story. But other artists have drawn out different aspects of the story's meaning. They do so in two primary ways. First, other artists bring other concerns to the text, whether cultural, emotional, or philosophical. Second, they depict the story in a different artistic medium, which naturally draws out different aspects of the meaning. We find examples of both methods in the paintings of the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. The Pre-Raphaelites were a 19th century British art movement that reacted against the academic art of their day, what they saw as stagnant and divorced from life. It should come as no surprise, then, that they were fascinated by Tennyson's poem. Perhaps they saw a resonance in the lady who abandoned her stagnant art to plunge into life, because that's the very same thing they sought to do in their art, to integrate it with life in a grand tapestry of meaning. Okay, John William Waterhouse is not technically a Pre-Raphaelite, but he's often lumped into that group's particular style. His version of the Lady of Shalott, depicted here, draws on the Pre-Raphaelite fascination with three things: idealized medievalism, intensity of detail, and nature mysticism. Following the British Arthurian revival, which Tennyson largely spearheaded, the Pre-Raphaelites perhaps saw in the Arthurian tales a more complete view of reality, one in which the natural world and social mores were imbued with spiritual significance. In other words, a world with no clean separation between mundane life and supernatural meaning. Everything physical had spiritual significance. This idealization of the Middle Ages accounts for the lady's medieval dress, which is very particular and detailed. However, the lady's detailed physicality contrasts with her ethereal expression. Her face is so particular, and yet you can't quite tell what her expression means. Is she despairing about her death? Is she awed at the nature around her? Is she seeing into the realm beyond this life? It's a sort of vague terror. The depiction of nature itself continues this ethereal particularity, this melding of the natural and the spiritual. Although naturally depicted, the landscape seems smudged with an unnatural dusky light. It casts a sort of glow around the lady and a pallor on the river in an odd mix of silvery greens and oranges. And I will say that this image here, I think, is slightly more orange than the original photo, so it has more of a cool tone than I think. Actually, that one looks pretty good. I don't know. It looks pretty good. Okay. It might be a little too orange. Still, the light is noteworthy. Chloe Portuguese points out the impressionistic techniques of the piece, the sort of delicate smudged effects which contribute to the feeling of the light as simultaneously ethereal and hyper-real. Perhaps the otherworldly light hints at the unknown, the unseen, which is always present behind or within everything we know and see. This nature mysticism fits nicely with the idea that the lady, too, is impinging on an unseen reality as she nears her death. Notice the candles in the boat beside the crucifix. Throughout the history of Christian art, candles often represent spirit, either the presence of the Holy Spirit or of a person's own soul. As Portuguese suggests, the candles seem to represent the lady's own life, As we can see, all but one of them has gone out, giving a sense of drama to her last moments. Imagine the fragility of a candle flame. One breath and it's gone. So too is the fragility of the lady's life. So Waterhouse offers a straightforward depiction of Tennyson's poem, but other pre-Raphaelites approach the story from different angles. William Holman Hunt, for example, seems less interested in the mystical implications of the poem and more interested in its moral and social aspects. Rather than depicting the lady's death, Hunt depicts the moment she turns away from her weaving and chooses one form of life over the other. The contortion of her form heightens the drama. As Inga Bryden writes, the lady is caught inside the loom, twisting in an echo of the threads flowing around her. She's in the midst of this dramatic choice. She also doesn't wear the spectral white of one dying, but rather the motley colors of one in the midst of life. However, where the previous works seem to implicitly approve the lady's choice, Hunt casts it in moral approbation. We can see this approbation in Hunt's use of light and shadow, which Rebecca Jeffrey Easby highlights in her Smart History article on the painting. The mirror itself glows with the white green of sunlit grass, and the mirror casts its light on the wide, rounded tapestry at the lady's feet. When the lady works on her art, she too sits in the light. However, as she rises and turns away, the top half of her body enters the shadow. On Hunt's reading, she's actually plunging herself into spiritual darkness. A common consensus among scholars is that the moral failing seems to be one of abandoning her duty. As evidence of the lady's failing, scholars often point out the art on the wall behind her. For example, Sharon R. Udall draws attention to Hercules and the Virgin Mary, both of whom might give an implicit model for how the lady should treat her duty. As Mary waited and suffered with Christ, so too, Hunt suggests, should the lady serve as the handmaiden to her art, holding fast with the valor of Hercules. She's supposed to wait and suffer and help bring forth beauty. Thus, Hunt recontextualizes the lady's curse as her duty. It is her vocation to remain in the tower and weave her tapestry. On this reading, her decision to leave constitutes a dramatic moral failing. He does still present her with sympathy, however. Entangled in the threads of her own weaving, she seems trapped and desperate to escape. The tapestry literally ties her down and keeps her from freely engaging with the world beyond. As William Emery Smizer writes, the curse has come upon her, the blown hair that is driven in wavy masses about her head, and the broken threads from the loom that entwine her with tangled persistence, being finely illustrative of the fatality that is her doom. Though she hasn't yet left the tower, her death is a foregone conclusion. Now, some interpreters have claimed that the painting rearticulates Tennyson's poem as a didactic statement about women's proper social role in Victorian society, that they're supposed to stay inside, take care of the children, literally do the weaving, etc. I do think this interpretation is partially valid. Certainly, Hunt might be influenced by the biases of his own social context. However, I don't think this gender role critique exhausts the meaning of the piece. So I want to offer another reading that sees the piece not as an intentional allegory for Victorian gender roles, but rather as a statement about the importance of art. That some people do have a vocation to remain separate from the world for the purpose of creating beauty, and that such a vocation can be a noble and valid way of loving the world. Sharon R. Udall describes how on this reading, the poem explores the sacrifices required of the artist and the noble duty the calling entails. According to this interpretation, Hunt is still offering a social critique, and it's quite possible that his views arise through a lens of Victorian rigidity, but the piece itself is so clearly, to me, about the spiritual importance of art. The lady weaves a tapestry about the Holy Grail, which, as we'll see in a later lecture, is latent with the highest spiritual significance. To abandon that art, the painting suggests, is at the very least a tragic loss. That's not to say that concerns about how gender is represented don't matter, because the Pre-Raphaelites do have things worthy of critique when it comes to depicting women. I just think that in this instance, to reduce the painting to Victorian social commentary would miss the breadth of what it's actually doing. Whatever the case, however we interpret the painting, we can't ignore the sympathy with which Hunt portrays her. Whether he himself was aware of it, he displays a character hopelessly caught in the tension between duty and freedom. In this tension, perhaps she's entangled in a social context that refuses her real flourishing, and she understandably seeks escape. So even if Hunt did intend this to moralistically blame her for her failure, I think the pathos of the figure speaks louder than any didactic intention he may or may not have had. Okay, so far we've seen readings about the inevitability of suffering in love, the sacredness of the natural world, and the complexity of social duties or vocation. Let's look at one more reading, a very modern one. This next piece is a song by the artist Emilie Autumn, who needs a bit of explanation. So Emilie Autumn is known for this very theatrical, Gothic, Victorian mad girl aesthetic. Most of her songs address themes of mental illness based on her own experiences. So I want to give a quick content warning. Her style as an artist often relies on dark shock value, and I think she displays some attitudes toward trauma that I don't find particularly helpful. However, I do think that looking at her work can be worthwhile. And in her next song, her attitude towards suffering will help us understand a profound layer of meaning to the Shalott story. This song, simply called Shalott, can be found on her album Opheliac, a concept album inspired by Ophelia from Hamlet. In Emilie Autumn's own words, the album explores the character archetype of the person, often a woman, who is bent on her own destruction. Something within her simply tends toward death, like Ophelia driven by supposed madness to drown herself. For Autumn, the Lady of Shalott instantiates this archetype while also reflecting real-world scenarios of mental illness and abusive relationships. Let's listen to the song and explore this understanding of the lady. So I'm going to play it and I'll pause it periodically to talk about it as we go. Okay. Okay, the first verse sets the scene and establishes the familiar problem. But this setup frames the narrative in the context of mental illness. She can't recall what it was like to feel, sounds very much like a reference to the numbness of depression, for example. After the familiar line, "I'm half sick of shadows," she compares herself to everyone else. They can see the sunset and fully experience life, so why can't I, she asks. She wants to see the world as they do, but is kept from doing so by obstacles outside her control. This comparison to others evokes the way a mood disorder might alienate a person from experiencing the breadth of life, or the way a personality disorder might alienate someone from meaningful contact with others. The struggling person might say, "Everyone else seems to have such full, rich lives. Why can't I have that? It's like I'm trapped in my own mind." The lady then experiences a desire to be free from that mental isolation. So we're going to keep going. So here she already knows she's going to die, but she doesn't know the circumstances of her death. This chorus contrasts that knowledge with her desire for life, expressed by the rain and the wind and the falling stars. The fervor of the weather reflects her fervent desire for freedom. Let's see how she glimpses her own freedom when Lancelot appears. She sees Lancelot and immediately knows he's going to cause her death. She also knows that her longing for him is unhealthy on some level. He doesn't know her name, and all the girls are all the same to him, and yet she longs for him. Curiously, though, she doesn't seem to desire him for his own sake. Rather, she desires him because he represents freedom to her. She says, even though he's indifferent to her, but still I've got to get out of here because I don't think I can face another night where I'm half sick of shadows. She wants him precisely because she feels that wanting him offers an escape from the prison of her own mind. Lancelot therefore serves more as a means to an end than as an end in and of himself. It's not that the lady wants Lancelot, she wants everything else. She wants the fullness of life. So let's continue. So we can see what she wants. She wants to see the willows and flowers and feel the breeze, but she doesn't realize this is her actual desire. She proclaims that even though she's going to die, she's going to sing to the one she loves and he will see her out in the open. So she turns from the mirror. Now this next line has an enjambment between the bridge and the next verse, which is interesting because it seems to reflect this idea of passing over, that she's like passing into a different form of life. So it's going to be a bit jarring, but here we go. All right, when she gets into the boat, she doesn't sing the mournful holy song of Tennyson. Instead, she has a bitter realization about the true nature of her curse. You can hear it in her voice, how vehemently she says, well, that explains a thing or two because I know I'm the cursed one. Unlike in Tennyson, this is not an exultant moment. She doesn't achieve the contact with life she's longed for. The repeated line at the end of the chorus changes to further express her bitterness. What began as the line, everyone can watch as the sun goes down, so why can't I? Turns into, in the second verse, everyone can watch as the tide comes in, so why can't I? But in the third verse, the line changes to, everyone can watch as their dreams untie, so why can't I? This line expresses a double bitterness. First of all, her dreams are indeed untying, but on an even more tragic level, she's going to die before she can experience the pain of that loss. At least staying alive would allow her to hurt and work through sorrow like the rest of humanity, but she doesn't even have that. Thus, Autumn's Lady of Shalott is a wholly tragic figure. In her misguided attempt to engage with life, she leaves the tower and willingly destroys herself because she falls in love with Lancelot. The song doesn't condone this willing destruction, but it acknowledges that the lady's undoing stems from a legitimate desire to experience life more fully, a desire shared by many with mental health difficulties. That's the tragedy. What the lady wants is good, but the way she thinks she's going to get what she wants is unhealthy and self-destructive, an analog to an abusive relationship, where she seeks salvation in another person who does not care about her. All right, I've talked about 4 major versions of this story. So let's reassess the overall meaning of the story in light of these interpretations. In all cases, the lady has a choice to make. Should she stay or should she go? It depends on the allegory we're working with. For Tennyson, leaving the tower means gaining the capacity to love. For Hunt, leaving the tower means abandoning duty. For Autumn, leaving for the sake of romantic love is an unhealthy coping mechanism to escape an unendurable reality. All 3 artists disagree about what the lady should do, but all feel the tension between the choice she must make. I think this tension gets at the core of what this story can mean. The tension between impossible choices where there's no unequivocal right answer. That's the lady's situation. The particular dichotomies she must choose between may work on many different levels. We can think of them as different layers of meaning that all overlap with each other. That's what good symbolism does. It allows us to experience a resonance of meaning. In this case, the story could look something like this. And just a quick aside, for this graph, I'm drawing on the way that the early church read the Bible, according to these different layers of meaning. So I'm twisting it a little bit. But basically, we're starting with the literal, and that's just the literal events of the story that happen, right? So it's a myth about a cursed lady. Then we have the allegorical, which is like, okay, what is it that this myth could represent? Here I have one allegory. We have artifice versus life, and I think we see that in Tennyson, we see that in Hunt. But other allegories could work as well. So in Emilie Autumn, it's an allegory for mental health difficulties, right? So the moral aspect is, okay, what is this? How does this story apply to the way that I live my life? And we can think about kind of questions about duty versus freedom. The personal and psychological is very similar to that, but these all kind of blend into each other. The personal and psychological is this idea of love versus self-destruction. We see that very clearly in Emilie Autumn's. We see that in Tennyson as well, although Tennyson is kind of combining the two, that there's some aspect of self-destruction in love, potentially. Then we have a philosophical, which could be contemplation versus experience, which is a more philosophical attitude toward the kind of artifice versus life question. Do you examine life from a distance, or do you dive into it and experience it? So how does this story portray the human condition? We too are hopelessly embedded in dichotomies we often can't choose between. Do we simply inhabit a hopeless universe where any choice is ultimately the wrong one? Do we, like the lady, have any hope of finding meaning in our finitude? The story seems to paint the human condition in quite pessimistic terms. We are trapped in an existential situation where suffering occurs no matter what choices we make. To answer that pessimism, I'm going to add another interpretation to our list, and that's an explicitly theological one. What I mean by theological is simply this. A theological reading has something to do with God and with our relation to God. God, as the source of all ultimate meaning, is a fitting focal point by which we might read this story and find meaning in it. In this reading, I seek to answer the story's tragic view of the human condition and offer a view of reality that speaks to, affirms, but ultimately redeems the hopelessness of the lady's situation. Now, as a Christian, I'm of course coming at this from a Christian perspective. I think theological readings can certainly be done from other theological traditions, so I'm not saying that this is the only way to theologically interpret a text. What I do want to suggest is that the Christian story affords itself really well to interpreting stories about suffering and human finitude in a way that I believe unlocks an incredible depth of meaning. I'm going to start with a Christological analogy. In the Tennyson poem, the lady leaves her realm of stagnant perfection to plunge into the dynamism and suffering of human life. While Christian theology by no means conceptualizes the Trinity as stagnant perfection, I do still find a certain analogy between the lady and the incarnation of Christ. Just as the lady chooses love at the risk of suffering, so too did Christ, who became a human being to take on the messy realities of our life. In doing so, he became present with us, and he ultimately suffered and died with us and for us. This suffering constitutes the ultimate act of love by which he bore the weight of human evil. His death inaugurates an astonishing reality that God is with us in suffering, with us in sorrow, and with us even in death. And through his resurrection, he actually transforms and overcomes death, promising to us that we too will rise again. The ultimate vision of Christian love is love that bears with suffering and redeems it. Now, reading the lady as a Christological figure can be interesting because we can clearly see how Hunt's and Tennyson's view of her contradict. For Hunt, the lady should have fulfilled her duty to stay with her weaving. However, if we read the Christological analogy into Tennyson's poem, her duty is exactly the opposite. Christian love means leaving her self-sufficiency at the risk of her own death. As Christ enters the world of pain to love it, so too should the lady. However, I bring this up just because I think it offers an interesting contrast to the theological layers of Hunt's reading. I don't actually think the lady is a sort of Christ figure or anything like that. Whereas Christ descends into humanity out of self-giving love, the lady leaves her tower out of loneliness and need. At the risk of making too sharp a distinction, Christ loves with agape, the lady loves with eros. But in this distinction, we see how the Christological reading actually answers the lady's existential tragedy. It is human to need connection, to want to encounter the world as it really is, to know it and love it even when it hurts. We are creatures of eros. That's not a failing on the lady's part. And it is precisely Christ's self-giving love that answers our need. The lady finds herself in a situation where she cannot make the right decision. Suffering will happen either way. But the Christian story speaks of a God who is present with us in suffering. That is ultimate reality. The lady seeks ultimate reality. She seeks to experience the fullness of things. And because of Christ, she can. That ultimate reality is always available to her, even in the moments before her tragic death, even in her death, because Christ died too. She's hopelessly embedded in a web of impossible decisions, but that hopelessness no longer cuts her off from reality. She can't make a right decision, and that's okay. The goal then is to seek that ultimate love at the center of all things. When you do that, you can't make a wrong choice because you can't escape from the love of God. Okay, I've presented 4 readings of this one story. Hopefully we can see how reading all of them together gives us a fuller picture of just how much this story means. It's not just about art and life or Victorian duty or mental illness or whatever. It's about all of these because it's most fundamentally about the human condition. Our need for connection, the difficulties of making impossible decisions. Thinking about these themes can help us understand our own embeddedness in life. Maybe it makes us wiser as we make our own decisions, or gives us humility when we find we can't make the right choice. Ultimately, I hope that such stories point us to the truth of who we are, that we are weak and finite, but upheld by the love of a good God. This truth is ineffable and can't be put into prosaic words that do it justice. The beauty of art is that you don't have to put it into words, because art makes the ineffable tangible. I hope my analysis, prosaic as it might be, has helped show how art achieves this feat. Now, one quick note before we end. It's my hope that these lectures start conversation. I do not have ultimate, final interpretations of any of these. I just have my own thoughts, and I'm always in the process of learning. Furthermore, I think learning is best done in conversation because it's when we converse that our minds are open to the thoughts of others and our understanding can really expand. So I encourage you all to chat with me, chat with each other, engage with some of this art. Keep thinking about these questions. More than anything, I hope that these lectures might help inspire wonder. And I hope you all have enjoyed this lecture. Next time, we'll be discussing 2 characters, Sir Gawain and Sir Percival, how they navigate the different spheres of nature, culture, and grace, and what their stories can tell us about how the Arthurian cosmos works. Thank you all so much for coming, and I hope to see you next time.